We talk about climate change as if it's one problem. It isn't. It's actually two. There's a long game cutting CO2, decarbonizing energy, rebuilding infrastructure over decades. And then there's the short game, the one most people aren't playing. The superpollutants, methane, HFCs, black carbon, gases that are dozens, sometimes hundreds of times more potent than CO2, but that disappeared from the atmosphere in years, not centuries. Here's what that means. If we cut them now, we feel the benefit now, not in 2080, but right now. And yet, the short game barely gets a seat at the table. The money, the policy, the headlines, they're almost all on CO2. My guest today has spent his career arguing that this is a mistake, that we're so focused on the marathon that we're losing the sprint. And the sprint is the one that determines whether we make it to the finish line at all. His name is Durwood Zaelke. He's the founder and president of IGSD, the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. He's a lawyer who thinks like a strategist, and he was a driving force behind the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, adopted in Rwanda in 2016, which is projected to prevent zero point 0.5 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100, making it arguably the single most impactful climate agreement ever signed. Durwood, welcome, and thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Wonderful. So Durwood, I mean, we had the chance to speak a few times, and it's always been fascinating to me. I didn't know about superpollutants until I met you, really, and the impact that it has in general global warming, and it's really expanded my horizons of what's possible, what we can do to tackle global warming in general. Could you basically walk us through a little bit, what the challenges are with global warming in general? We'll get to Montreal Protocol, which I'm excited to talk about,
Mhm.
but could you frame it for the person who maybe isn't experienced in this area? What is causing global warming and where are the real low-hanging fruit?
So you could consider climate change in terms of three concepts: temperature, time, and tipping points. So it is already too hot. We're effectively at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial level. That's the first guardrail of the Paris Climate Agreement. And we have too little time before we start passing the irreversible tipping points. That means we're close to the point of no return. That's the language that Jim Hansen likes to use, where we pass a threshold of temperature and something in the climate system changes in a way that's going to be catastrophic and irreversible on human timescale. That includes the shutdown, for example, of the Atlantic meridional circulation, AMOC. And when that happens, the warm water that's carried from the tropics up north to north of Europe, it keeps Europe quite temperate, will remain in the south, and it'll contribute to accelerated melting of the Antarctic glaciers, and and the northern part of the world that used to get the warm water will enter a very cold future. Now, this is an irony, but Europe could be much 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 colder, and that's just from one of the tipping points. Another would be the Amazon forest. So right now, the Amazon forest takes a lot of carbon dioxide, the principal climate pollutant, out of the atmosphere, stores it safely in biomass and in soil. But we're destroying that forest both because we're greedy and we're cutting it down principally for agriculture and meat production, as you know, and we're also losing it to wildfires, which are no longer really wildfires, but fires that are often associated with the warming planet. So the Amazon is beginning to turn into a source of carbon dioxide emissions rather than a sink that pulls the CO2 out of the atmosphere. And the great climate scientist in Brazil, Carlos Nobre, tells us, that right now we've destroyed maybe 20% of the Amazon, and somewhere between 20 and 25% destruction, the Amazon will complete the job on its own. It will destroy itself once we hit that threshold. So that's also incredibly dangerous. There's the Arctic ice sheet. Okay, so the Arctic ice sheet sends tremendous amount of incoming solar radiation safely back to space today. We've lost half of it, and we could lose the second half within 15 or 20 years. And that will add the equivalent of 25 years worth of CO2 emissions. And that will accelerate the collapse of the permafrost. And the permafrost, which we used to think of as permanent frost, stores ancient deposits of carbon dioxide and methane, one of the super climate pollutants, as well as N2O or laughing gas. And so you start a cascade of self amplifying feedbacks, feed upon themselves, accelerate the problem. And we go past even more of the tipping points. There are five that the scientists tell us exist between 1.5 and 2 degrees. We could hit the 2 degree above pre-industrial times by 2045, maybe sooner, depending on the accelerated rate of warming. Again, you start these feedbacks kicking in, and the rate of warming accelerates. And so we could end up being in worse shape even faster than the models predict. And the models, by the way, are just models. They're subject to their assumptions. And there are many things they can't model well. They're not very good at modeling ice sheet dynamics, for example. They don't always include the right feedbacks. There are 27 feedbacks that have been identified that are accelerating warming. So time, or rather temperature, time, and tipping points, those are the three concepts. Now, if you use that frame and you see the time scale that we're talking about, that we could pass the 2 degree mark in 15 years, we could start tripping over the tipping points tomorrow because we're at 1.5 today. The Greenland ice sheet could tip, for example, at 1.6 degrees is one of the predictions. That is literally tomorrow. And so with that frame, you have to say, let's look at what is the fastest way to turn down the warming. It seems like a very logical conclusion when you look at the science. And you would look naturally first at the biggest contributor to climate change historically, and that's carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels. And that's looking backwards historically. And carbon dioxide is about 55% of historic warming. The other 45% is non carbon dioxide, principally the short lived super climate pollutants. But looking backwards is really not the direction that will give you the biggest insight to action for the future. It's looking to the future. And what you see is that cutting the fossil fuel use of and the CO2 that produces by decarbonizing the energy system and moving to clean energy. While that's essential, it only turns down warming in a very slow way. At 2050, it avoids about 1/10 of a degree Celsius of warming. In fact, the first decade that you decarbonize, you're actually adding warming. This is a bit uncomfortable, inconvenient truth. But when you shut down fossil fuel facilities, you don't just stop emitting carbon dioxide as you might in a model. You stop emitting all the co-emitted pollutants as well. And some of those, the sulfates, are highly reflective and they nucleate reflective clouds. And that means they are cooling the planet. And so when you shut down the fossil fuel facilities, the sulfates fall out in a matter of days to weeks, and they unmask existing warming that they've been hiding for a very long time. And that unmasking means that it's harder to get the fast response out of decarbonization. It's also hard politically because the fossil fuel industry is so powerful, so entrenched, and it's going to take us a long time to make the transition to 100% clean energy. It'll happen because the renewables are cheaper, they're better, no pollution, and eventually that will happen. But the time is slow politically, And then even if you could do it very quickly by 2050, you'd only avoid a tenth of a degree of warming. So the CO2 or the carbon dioxide strategy, essential, but you have to think of it like a marathon. It's a long race that we have to win, but it doesn't turn down warming in the near term. Then you look at the non-CO2 short-lived superpollutants, and these are HFCs, or the hydrofluorocarbon refrigerants, the methane, which is the single biggest piece of this, and remember, natural gas is methane, and it's also tropospheric ozone, which is ground level ozone, a secondary pollutant formed in the presence of sunlight. I grew up in Los Angeles, and I know you lived there for a while. And when I was a kid, we had smog alert days that meant you couldn't go out for recess because the smog was so bad. Kids could not go out and breathe that stuff. LA is much better. We do know how to clean up tropospheric ozone these days, or urban smog. And then the last one is the black carbon soot. So if you've ever been trapped behind a slow moving truck going uphill, especially if it's an old diesel, that black stuff that comes out of the tailpipe, that's black carbon. And it's a very potent greenhouse um, pollutant. It's not a gas, it's an aerosol. And it's particularly damaging when it hits snow and ice because it darkens the surface of snow and ice, reduces the reflectivity or albedo, and that allows more of the incoming heat to be absorbed, and that accelerates the melting of the snow and ice, which in fact is another one of the self-amplifying feedbacks. So you look at that suite of the non-CO2 superclimate pollutants, and you see that you could avoid 4 times more warming at 2050 than just decarbonizing, getting rid of CO2. 4 times more. So this is the way to slow down near-term warming. And we can think of it as a sprint. We need to win the sprint quickly to turn down warming, and that will turn down the self-amplifying feedbacks, and it will avoid or at least delay the tipping points. Okay, so this is an essential strategy: marathon with carbon dioxide and a sprint with non CO2 super climate pollutants, the short lived ones. They give you 90% of their benefit in a decade. So it's fast. Anyway, that's the frame here. And then you want to say, now now that we have a target, now that the scientists have told us what our best targeting is, uh, how do we go about it? And the world started with HFCs, or the hydrofluorocarbon refrigerants, because we had an incredible agreement, the Montreal Protocol, that had already succeeded in reducing to almost 100% other refrigerants. So the Montreal Protocol started in 1987, and it has reduced nearly 100 offending chemicals by nearly 100% since it started. And the HFCs, they're also refrigerants that destroy, that they cause warming, but they don't destroy stratospheric ozone. Okay, so they're a replacement for chemicals like CFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons, and they were replaced by HCFCs, and now we're moving to HFCs. And if you were looking at the Montreal Protocol and you were just thinking of stratospheric ozone, you'd say, well, this treaty has solved that problem. And the HFCs have no effect on that, so job done. But in 1975, a great scientist that now is at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla at the University of California, San Diego, Professor Ramanathan, said, my colleagues, Mario Molina, Sherry Rowland, and Paul Crutzen, the trio that later shared the Nobel Prize in chemistry, They had discovered in 1974 that the CFCs were migrating to the upper atmosphere and destroying the stratospheric ozone layer. So they were, and they won the Nobel Prize for that. But the next year, Ramanathan says, "Hey, by the way, these are also super climate pollutants. So let's think about how we're going to deal with this." But the Montreal Protocol really didn't pay attention to the climate benefits it was producing until 2007. So in 2007, one of the low-lying islands, the Federated States of Micronesia in the Pacific, said, with a little assistance from us, what is the fastest way to slow sea level rise? Now, I'll pause for a moment just to explain that in 1989, I started a group with two brilliant young British barristers, Philippe Sands and James Cameron, and my late wife, Barbara Shaw, a group called the Center for International Environmental Law, CL. And our value proposition in 1989, when we went to the Ford Foundation for our initial funding, was that we wanted to provide international environmental law expertise to low-lying island states who are about to start negotiating the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the Ford Foundation said, brilliant idea, we'll give you some money. And then we decided, okay, we better find a way to organize the islands. And so we helped them set up a group called AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS. So now jump ahead to 2006, I think it was, um, in the discussion with Federated States of Micronesia. They asked the question, what's the fastest way to slow down warming and slow down sea level rise? And the answer they discovered was cutting the HFCs using the Montreal Protocol. So they proposed a decision in 2007 to accelerate the phase out of HCFCs to both protect stratospheric ozone and explicitly to protect climate. Now, this was a period, 2007, George Bush was the president, and he was talking to the conservative prime minister of Canada, Harper, I think it was, and they were discussing whether they should sunset the Montreal Protocol. The treaty had done its job with stratospheric ozone, and they were, Bush had withdrawn from the Kyoto Protocol, and was saying, well, maybe I could go a step further, and we could start by moving the Montreal Protocol from an annual meeting to maybe every 2 or 3 years. Then we would sunset that. And so one of the discussions among the all the bureaucrats who ran the Montreal Protocol was, you guys better get your act together and become a climate treaty, because you're going to be put out of business if you don't. So the Federated States of Micronesia gave them an excuse to move to the climate benefits. And within a 6-month blitz, the Montreal Protocol agreed to a decision to accelerate the phase out of HCFCs explicitly for climate change. And that was a huge benefit. And that produced 5 times more climate benefit than the Kyoto Protocol. 5 times. Okay.
Amazing.
And President Bush ended up supporting that. He had a guy in the White House who ran climate for him, Jim Connaughton. Connaughton was a very smart guy and not an ideologue, and did a terrific job. And he had a couple of staff people working for him, Dave Banks and Elizabeth Latt, who were fantastic in moving this through the bureaucracy for the United States. Then the Federated States of Micronesia said, well, that was a good start here. Now, can we do more? And so they looked around and they said, well, HFCs are now coming in, and they're not damaging stratospheric ozone, but they're super climate pollutants. Why don't we go after them? And now that would require an amendment, because the they're not already under the control of the Montreal Protocol, so you can't accelerate a phase out or phase down. You have to bring them in. That requires an amendment. So they said, well, that's okay. We'll propose an amendment. And they got Mauritania, they got Morocco. They started lining up other developing countries, and they built a coalition that ultimately led to the entire world. And it took a long time. This it
This is
wasn't
one of
a
my, this is one of the most fascinating parts, I think, of how you were able, or you or your team or the group of that was involved in this was able to really bring this coalition together and ultimately make it become sort of a binding agreement, right? Could you talk more about that?
Yeah. Well, the Montreal Protocol is a binding agreement.
Mhm.
So that means, if you don't comply with the schedule for phasing out these chemicals, you are first you go to the compliance committee, which is basically a get well committee that says, what do you need to get back into compliance? You need more funding from the multilateral fund. You need technical assistance. We'll provide it. If you still don't move into compliance, there are trade measures that can be imposed. Now, they've been threatened once, but never imposed because the parties have always gone back to compliance. And we measure that through as air samples from around the world. We measure the concentrations in the atmosphere of these chemicals down to parts per billion, and we can tell whether the world is on track. And if they're not, we can pinpoint the area where they're off track. So this happened a couple of years ago with the emissions of CFC 11, and it turned out they were coming from somewhere in eastern China. Uh, and the scientist, Steve Monska and team, brought this to the attention of the Montreal Protocol parties through the scientific assessment panel of the convention. And China never admitted it was at fault, but it corrected the problem. And then the scientists measured again a few years later and said, we're back on track. So it works. It's remarkable that it works. Now, what we did was help parties understand the potential. That was our job. We wrote scientific papers, several with Mario Molina, the Nobel laureate who since passed away, unfortunately, several with Professor Ramanathan, and with other scientists to lay out the opportunity if you were to use the Montreal Protocol. You could get this tremendous benefit for climate. And the world slowly saw that thanks to the initiative of the islands. And Brazil came in, and Argentina, and the Europeans. And pretty soon, and it was a north-south coalition. It wasn't the North coming in and saying, we're the big bullies here. You guys all do what we want. And it wasn't the South saying, we're the victims, and you got to help us. They came together and said, this is a good thing to do. And they did it again. It wasn't fast this time. It took several years. It wasn't until 2016. So it took almost 8 years to convince the world to amend the Montreal Protocol. And this is the 10th anniversary of what became the Kigali Amendment, because the amendment was done in Kigali, Rwanda, after an all-night negotiating session on Friday night. So the Montreal Protocol meets twice a year for 5 days each time. Once in the summer, the open-ended working group, and then once in the fall or early winter to do the decision-making meeting, called the MOP, the meeting of the parties. And in Rwanda, in October, the decision was taken on October 15th. So we started, 6 days before that, and negotiated day and late into the night. But on the final day, Friday. We negotiated all night, all Friday night. And maybe at 2 o'clock in the morning, the parties had an agreement in principle. And that was fantastic. But it had to be turned into the legal language of the treaty. And they assigned it to two English speaking lawyers, one from the US, Sue Biniaz, a brilliant lawyer, and one from the UK, whose name I unfortunately have forgotten. And they turned it into the very precise language. Paragraph 6J bis is amended to strike blah, 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 and insert blah, blah, blah. Okay. And this is a binding treaty. So you got to get this exactly right. So that goes on several hours. It's getting, it's 5 o'clock, maybe 6 o'clock in the morning,
Whoa.
and people are getting tired. Some people, there was one NGO there who had left Friday night because they wanted to see the gorillas, and if they had been on my team, they'd have not had a job when they came back because you don't abandon the process when the action is not concluded. So maybe 5 o'clock, the secretariat puts the legal language on the screen. So everybody's got to go through the language. They get a chance to edit, to comment, edit, question, and so that goes on now for another couple of hours. And finally, we have an agreement. It's like the president of the meeting, Vincent Baruta, who was the minister of the environment from Rwanda, bangs down the gavel about 7 a.m. And they turn on some dance music, and everybody gets up and starts dancing around. I mean, it's
Wow.
really thrilling because the Montreal Protocol amendment, the Kigali Amendment, will avoid 1/2 a degree Celsius of future warming. That's a really big bite out of the
Amazing.
climate problem by the end of the century. And but we weren't done yet. The parties had to sit back down 7:30, whatever it was, after we stopped dancing, and Rwanda and Morocco, who was going to host the climate meeting in literally 2 weeks, um, had decided that they would submit a decision for putting energy efficiency of cooling equipment into the Montreal Protocol. So we had observed that every time the Montreal Protocol required a change of refrigerants, the manufacturers of cooling equipment upgraded their products and made them more efficient because they could. They could have a more efficient heat exchanger, a more efficient motor, and they could do it without really any extra cost. Prices had gone down, and they could upgrade their products. So we thought, well, if that happens naturally, how much more could we get if we made it part of the treaty and made it eligible for some of the funding from the Montreal Protocol Multilateral Fund? So the parties sit back down, and they're all so excited because we have done something remarkable to amend the treaty that they had a short discussion, and they agreed to the decision, and that brought in a strategy that has the ability to double the climate benefits. Right? This is remarkable. So we did an analysis with the International Energy Agency and UNEP, and our chief scientist, Dr. Gabrielle Dreyfus, was the lead. And Mario Molina and I were the co-chairs of the steering committee and did the preface for the report. That report concluded that you could do twice as much avoided climate emissions by 2050. It was like up to 460 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. If you did the energy efficiency part at the same time you were switching refrigerant. So just to conclude on the Montreal Protocol, the most recent analysis shows that it is on track to avoid 2.5 degrees of warming by the end of the century. That is 1.7 degrees from taking out the refrigerants, and another nearly 1 degrees, point 0.85, maybe more, Celsius from protecting sinks like forests that were otherwise going to be degraded by the extra UVB radiation that came in through a destroyed ozone layer. So if we had not protected the ozone layer, not only would we have had skin cancer, and this Band-Aid right here is covering a biopsy for skin cancer from my days as a young surfer when we did not have sunscreen, and I got fried many times in the beginning of the summer. And
In
not only
Southern
would
California.
Southern California, not only would we have had massive skin cancer and cataracts and immune suppressant, but um,
It,
but
it
it would
feels
have
it, feel,
degraded the sinks.
it feels, Drew, that for many people, I think that we're just getting started on tackling climate change, right? Like for a lot of people, it's like,
Yeah,
oh, now is the
yeah.
time we're going to get started on this. And I think it's so great to sort of frame how much has been done already and how much in what worse condition we would be if we hadn't done, the work that you've done, if it hadn't been executed and successfully, even probably at a time. Would you consider the time today more difficult to move on climate change issues, or was it
Yeah,
more difficult back then? Because what an
yeah.
achievement! I mean, incredible.
Well, the Montreal Protocol has saved the planet. I mean, if
Mhm.
we did not have the Montreal Protocol and didn't have its success, we would have passed these tipping points long ago. I mean, and we'd be literally over the cliff of these irreversible tipping points. I have this discussion often where I'll be on a panel with other climate people, and I'll talk about the Montreal Protocol. And there's always somebody on the panel who says, that was easy, you know, and
Right.
that was only the HFs, the fluorinated gases, the refrigerants. You only did one sector. And, my response after I bite my tongue is, well, it wasn't that easy.
Hmm.
Um, the industry fought just like the fossil fuel industry, the chemical industry fought this. They belittled Mario Molina and Sherry Rowland. They were on the cover of the tabloids in the supermarkets saying, in the stories, oh, these guys are telling us there's an invisible gas that goes up to destroy an invisible ozone layer and let in invisible rays that are going to harm us. They're just a bunch of quacks. And so they were ostracized by the other chemists. Their funding was jeopardized. They were at the University of California, Irvine, and of course they were vindicated later when they won the Nobel Prize in chemistry. But they had a real struggle, and they were heroes because they didn't just say we're going to do the science. They said we're going to bring this into the political realm because it's so important. And they were tough guys. There's a great lecture that they gave, the John Chafee Memorial Lecture, and it's titled something like, saving the ozone layer. If not us, who? If not now, when? Something like that. And they tell of their struggles. I mean, they were,
Yeah.
this was not easy. So, but it is easier in the sense that if you take one bite out of the climate problem and you design an agreement or a treaty that learns how to solve that bite, that learns how to digest that bite, then you have a better chance of success. So Montreal said, we're going to do the fluorinated gases and now energy efficiency of cooling as well. And we're going to learn how to do that. And they started modestly, and they learned by doing. They learned by implementing the requirements, and they built their confidence. They said, "Oh man, we can do that," and that
Hmm.
confidence led to further ambition. And so, when I was first getting ready to help people with the accelerated phase out of HCFCs back in 2006, I went to see the father of the Montreal Protocol, Mustafa Tolba, who was a great Egyptian scientist. And he'd retired, was living in Cairo, but very graciously hosted me for a 3 hour lunch, maybe a 4 hour lunch, a long lunch. And he told me some great stories about how he had wrangled the Montreal Protocol. And he would lock negotiators in the room and say, you're not coming out until you've got a text that you agree to. At the end of that long lunch, he said, I'm going to leave you with two takeaway messages. The first one is that science matters this much. Now, I interpreted that to mean that science is the essential foundation, but never on its own will solve the political problem. If it did, we wouldn't have a climate problem. The science is so clear, and yet you have to have it. So it's the foundation. And the second takeaway that Mustafa Tolba left me with was that the Montreal Protocol was a start and strengthen treaty. Started modestly with what politics allowed, and learned by doing, gained confidence, did more and more and more and more. It's been amended 5 times. It's been adjusted to accelerate phase out schedules many, many, many times. So it evolves in a way that gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And remember, it's mandatory. So this is different. It's mandatory. Now, back to your question, it is really inspiring to know that we climbed this mountain once. We climbed Everest. We have a path that got us to the top, and we can climb it again. And so the next thing that I think the world needs to do, and Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados is the lead on this. She says
Very
it's time
impressive
for the
woman,
world.
by the way. Incredibly impressive woman. My goodness.
Well,
Yeah.
watch her interview with Trevor Noah. Okay,
Yeah.
she does a 90-minute interview with Trevor in the last just a month ago or so, and they're both so talented and so funny. And watching them discuss the world for 90 minutes, including methane. So she is the champion, saying Montreal Protocol has done this great job. Methane doesn't fit in the Montreal Protocol, but the Montreal Protocol can be our inspiration for another sectoral agreement to start controlling methane, starting with the oil and gas sector, because that is ready. We know the technology. We can do 70% of the work that needs to be done at no net cost. Basically, stop wasting gas. That's what methane is, gas. And Prime Minister Mia Mottley says, burning gas is wasting cash. If you're flaring, if you're wasting your cash. And so this is the next piece. Can we create an agreement that is mandatory and locks in promises that have been made, for example, at COP28 of the climate meeting back in just a few years ago? And the Sultan El Jaber, who was the president of the COP and also the president of the National Oil Company for UAE, ADNOC, he got 56 oil and gas companies to agree to the Oil and Gas Decarbonization Charter, where they promised to stop flaring and to reduce their leak rate to near zero, defined as 0.2% or less. And they promised to do that by 2030. Okay, so that's a great promise. That's 56 oil and gas companies, including I think 34 are national oil companies, 22 are private, and they know they can do it. They said they would do it. They said they'd do it fast by 2030. But if we don't lock that promise in with a mandatory agreement, there will be excuses that there's a problem in Venezuela. There's a problem in the Strait of Hormuz. There's this, there's that. and we can't do it. So we're gonna take a pass here. And so it's essential to move to something that's binding. And the European methane regulation, which is progressively implemented to 2030, has already banned flaring, um, and um, and it's going to be setting a standard for methane intensity. Presumably, it'll be 0.2%, near zero, or less even. Because if you look at the leader, Norway is probably the best, but some of the Gulf states are also very good, and some in the U.S. like EQT have low methane intensity gas, and it's closer to 0.1% or less. And so, you could go even stronger, or you could start with zero point 0.2 and then have a way of ratcheting up over time to make sure you're squeezing out the emissions. So, and then after that, yes, there's probably a need for an international agreement on waste as well. You're one of the experts on waste, and your strategy of avoiding and putting it in the landfills is like that's brilliant. And but you'd want a different kind of agreement than oil and gas. And maybe you want oil, gas, and coal over here because coal bed methane is important too. Waste is different, and it's regulated at the municipal level, at the national level sometimes, and requires a different set of solutions. And so, you want
Yeah.
to craft something that fits the specific problem. Get to agriculture, well, very sensitive because farmers of the world have a hard time feeding us in a warming planet. It's getting harder and harder. Rainfall shifts, droughts come more frequently, wildfires come. I mean, it's heat stress makes many crops harder to grow. So we need to be anything we do with methane from agriculture has to start from the premise that we need to help the farmers of the world. It's you can't give them an assignment that they can't do. You got to say, here are the things we can do to help you be better at your job feeding us, and we can integrate some methane mitigation into that. So, but that's into the future. Right now, oil, gas, and coal are ready to go, and we should be following Prime Minister Mia Mottley's advice and developing a coalition of the willing, just those who are ready to do this, and then inviting others to join later.
And how would that work? If you let's say you have the global methane pledge, right? What would you say to the global methane pledge participants in this regard specifically? And it does make sense to me, really, on a very targeted, sector-driven. Like you said from your experience in the
Mhm.
past, we really focus on an industry. We really focus on one problem, and that's going to generate a meaningful impact. What would you say to those who are looking at the Gold Methane Pledge and how that fits with the binding agreement?
Right. So the methane pledge was a great way to get started. And one of the catalysts for the pledge was back in 2020 when the European Commission said, in the run up to the COP that year, we should encourage the world to develop a binding agreement on methane. This is 2020, European Commission. 2021, the European Parliament says, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's make this a priority to develop a binding international agreement on methane. Well, that strategy at that moment didn't get very far, but it was the critical catalyst for the global methane pledge, number one, and for the European methane regulation that is being progressively implemented to 2030. So it it took um, a side trail, very important, and two great um, successes, but the pledge has has flatlined at this point. It's helped educate countries. 159 have signed on to the pledge, and many have put some methane mitigation into their nationally determined contribution to climate mitigation under the Paris Agreement, and that's great. That's still voluntary. It just says, this is what we think we can do, is what we plan to do. Sometimes they're absolute pledges, and sometimes they're conditional. Say we will do this extra if you give us some money, if somebody gives us some money. And uh, so we had we took the opportunity to educate people, but now methane emissions are still going up. You can measure this, you know. So I think the people, many of the people I work with on methane say we've accomplished quite a bit on methane. More money is coming in, more technology. We're getting some more national um, regulations. So Canada, for example, in December 2025, just a couple of months ago, passed its enhanced methane regulations for oil and gas. And they rely on a calculation that this will create 34,000 more jobs in Canada to comply with these regulations. People who take a wrench and go fix a pipeline, people who fly drones to measure whether there are any leaks or not. So it's um, it's had value.
And is there a parallel with sort of the trajectory that happened with the Montreal Protocol that would be very similar? I mean, how would this be structured, and
Yeah.
how would that work from here out?
Well, I think about this every day, Ian.
And we got COP
Uh,
31 coming up, right? So there's a
yeah.
legacy here of some movement into COP 30, and is it time now? Is
Yeah.
this when it's going to happen?
Well, first of all, Montreal Protocol is completely separate from the COPs.
Hmm.
It's not. You can think of the COP, the Paris Agreement, as like the mothership, and the Montreal Protocol is a sister agreement that has done its piece, and you can take that sister agreement, plug it into the mothership, and do the accounting. And then if you were to do a methane agreement, you'd want it to be outside of the COPs. You don't want it to be under the COP and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, because that's basically the black hole. Nothing's ever going to emerge from that is mandatory. It does not have the DNA to be mandatory. And I think of the story I read many years ago in George Orwell's book, Down and Out in Paris and London, when he was a young man, very poor, working manual labor jobs. But he describes the British poorhouses of the 1800s. They were placed on the outskirts of London. You could stay one night, the poor. You could stay one night and you could get one meal. And then you had to walk all day. They were placed one day's walk apart. You had to walk all day to the next one. So you had this thin gruel, to give you just enough sustenance to walk all day to the next one. Spend one night, one meal. So that kept the poor from organizing, from gathering. They kept them weak and wandering around London. And the UNFCCC is a lot like that. Year to year, we get thin gruel that comes out, and we feel like it's just enough to walk around the world to the next COP and try it again. And we get one more meager meal, and so I'm a bit of a skeptic about getting more than that meager meal out of UNFCCC. So a methane agreement, you'd want it to be outside. And yes, there are parallels. Montreal Protocol started very small. First of all, it started at the local level, really. It started with citizens who boycotted hairspray, underarm deodorant spray that was using CFCs as the propellant. So bug spray, every kind of a spray can was using CFCs right into the atmosphere, destroying stratospheric ozone, causing warming. So it started with citizen boycotts, and then some states like California Some countries like the U.S., Europe, they said, okay, we can ban this stuff, starting with spray cans, and then in the negotiations for the Montreal Protocol, it was 24 countries who signed initially. Now it has universal membership, 197, 98, whatever. I can't remember what the number is now. Countries divide up and anyway, but it's universal membership, and every previous amendment has been ratified by every country. Montreal is on its way. I think it's or Kigali amendment is on its way. I think it has 172 maybe on its way to universal. So we need to think of the same thing. So I was in India last week to launch a report that we were doing with the government of Himalaya Pradesh in the Himalayas, and I went to Shimla, which is the town in the Himalayas. It was the British summer capital when the Brits were the colonial powers of India, and a beautiful, beautiful part of the world. And the report was on non CO2 action plan. What should this state do? We are working with 12 states now, and the total population of those 12 states is more than 800 million people. These are big states. India is a big country, nearly 1.5 billion. We are hoping to go help even more. But so this is the beginning where I mentioned Canada with its new regulation. Mexico has a regulation. Norway has been a leader for a very long time. European Union as a whole has their regulation. So these pieces are percolating up from the bottom, and there's a movement of citizens to boycott gas stoves. It's like, get rid of your gas stove, get rid of your gas hot water heater, move to solar. That's a good bottom up piece as well. So now there is a challenge of AI. So AI is driving a huge energy demand for data centers, and that demand should be filled with renewables. Renewables are the cheapest and the fastest, but some of it is going to be filled, it looks like, by gas. And so there are new gas plants that are being planned to satisfy um, AI. And these data centers, these data companies like Meta and Google and um, Microsoft, they should make a pledge right now to only buy the gas that has the lowest methane intensity and has no flaring. I mean, they should be leaders in their procurement here, building the market. So, like your effort to do to build the market through on the waste side, this is they could do that,
I
and
heard
that's something that
I read recently that about 75% of the new added power was natural gas. So and all of it really is onshored,
right.
right? So even if you have a better grid elsewhere, like Brazil or other nations where you have
Yeah.
more renewables or less intensity, the preference has been for fast delivery natural gas, unfortunately, but it's gonna be a real challenge, right? And I think
Yeah,
that
but
for-
but they have the ability, to. I mean, right? I mean, you're working with many of these companies that have said now we're gonna buy credits and help build markets. Well, they could do the same thing with,
yeah,
and if they're going to use gas, they should make, they should say, well, we're going to do renewables whenever we possibly can, but when we have to use gas, we're going to make sure it's low methane intensity and no routine flaring, just like all these companies promised to do. It's not that hard to make people keep their promises. I mean, anyway, that's something we should be working on.
Yeah, and I guess one thing we could say that is exciting is this initiative that was launched this very week, right? We had the Super Pollutant Action Initiative that was launched this very week with a $100 million commitment from some of these big tech companies, um, and it's a step forward. I mean, I think it's something about says something about that goal of attacking super pollutants in general. Would you have any advice for them in particular? What would you say to them?
Well, I would say good start, but let's bump it up to $1 billion. I mean, not you guys are rolling in cash. Let's do more. Have a goal of moving to 1 billion in the next 3 years, and moving fast. I mean,
Yeah.
it's great to see when you can line up market incentives with good mitigation measures. It's great. I'm all for that. But they could do more. I mean, at 100 million, is good. But look at the net worth of the companies. Look at the net worth of the founders of these companies. I mean, it's so many billions.
Yeah.
Let's move it up. Thank you for starting. You know,
Yeah.
that's
And,
fantastic.
and
Let's
I
do
think,
more.
and this will reminds me of one of our first conversations, which was it really kind of hooked me for good. And it was the spirit. What should be our spirit at this time, given the temperature challenges and the breaking points, as you mentioned. You know, what would you like? What is the spirit? I mean, it's we're talking about taking risks right now. We need to
Yeah,
move fast, right, with capital. Um,
right.
so that's one of the great memories that I have of our conversations in the past. So I think that I think that they need, hopefully we'll see more ambition coming from not just those companies, but we can include many more, right?
Well, you know the financial system. The one of the top people at Allianz, the German reinsurance company, a few months ago said climate is getting so bad that major assets of the world will no longer be insurable. And when that happens, capitalism itself will freeze up. Now, on the one hand, you could say those invested in the capitalist system would take note and say, well, maybe it's time for us to get on the bandwagon with climate protection here, because we don't want our system that gives us all of our rewards and excess rewards in many cases to collapse. You'd think maybe that'd be a natural response, and that could that might be good for us. On the other hand, if capitalism crashed, maybe that's a better strategy. I mean, is that what we need to? And now I'm being a bit facetious, because if capitalism freezes up, and the there's so many of the poor who will suffer, so much so fast. It's not the ideal solution, but this is there are those who in the financial world who say that the financial system will collapse before the climate system collapses. And so paying attention to how financial risk is being managed, how insurance companies whose job is really pricing risk, you know, should be entering big time into the solution side. So
Yeah, and
yeah,
you
so
mentioned
there
you mentioned also this sort of it impacts people differently, right? Some people might be harmed more by climate changes. Though in many cases, those who have the resources are going to be able to really adjust, adapt quickly. And many of the nations, like we were talking about, earlier today, the small island nations, right? What can they do, right? It's
yeah.
very difficult. And you've been very involved in this, and so it'd be interesting to think about the importance of these agreements or these movements, and if something is going to happen in the near term. And do you feel that is we're on our way? Is are we have we arrived at the super pollutant moment?
We're getting there. I mean, we've
Hmm.
we've come a long way in the last decade. I wrote one of my very first papers on superpollutants with Mario Molina in 2008, I think it was, and I've been working on it, several years before that. So we've come a long way, and foundations have put more money in, led by some in the U.S., some in Europe, and that's to their great credit. They see that this is important. There's still a bit of a battle between those who focus just on CO2, clean energy. There are people who say, you bring the focus over to the non CO2, you're creating a moral hazard. Well, the moral hazard argument is pulled out when somebody has a strategy that you don't like. It's like
Yeah.
don't steal my funding, don't steal my spot here, and but you have to do both. And the world is, even the CO2 focused people are beginning to accept the problem of unmasking and beginning to say we need a dual strategy. The Trump administration has made this more challenging right now, but the politics always change, and so we're in a moment where the demand for climate governance has to find new channels to flow through. And it's the private sector, like this coalition you mentioned. It's the initiative of people from the bottom up in cities and states around the world, in the Himalayas and and the islands like Federated States of Micronesia. So the demand doesn't go away. It just finds different and sometimes more creative ways to flow. And then when the opportunities come back on the global stage, you're ready. And so you never want to stop moving forward. You never want to give in to despair. And I was talking to one of the leading climate diplomats of the world a couple of months ago, and I was saying, I think Prime Minister Mia Mottley is correct in wanting the methane agreement, and he said, a methane agreement would be very difficult, but not impossible, and that's exactly the space where we should be working. And he said, if people had asked us in the run up to the Paris Agreement whether it was possible, a lot of people would have said it's going to be really difficult to get a Paris Agreement, but not impossible.
Yeah.
So, that's where we are, and we can make progress if we're creative. You can develop better technology. You can develop programs with consumers, with students, with progressive companies, with technology innovators. I mean, there's just so many opportunities for things to move forward. And you're part of this. I mean, you're a guy who has figured out how to solve specific pieces of the problem, and then you teach more people, and they teach more people, and so it's happening. I mean, but it's also there's some pretty dark clouds on the horizon, that
Yeah. Yeah.
we have to acknowledge too.
And it's very difficult. I mean, when we're talking about things like, adding and bringing capital into these areas that need, to be catalyzed, right? We need to catalyze change in some areas. We need to um, think differently about policy, and even creatively about financing. So it's a fun challenge. I mean, it's very difficult to do, but it's very exciting at the same time. And I can just think back to your moment when that agreement was signed, what it must have meant to you. To that dance party must have been pretty good at
It
that
was
time.
Well, success makes you want more success.
Yeah.
So helping people find some success, even if it starts small, gives you confidence. It's like we did
Yeah.
this, you know, and let's find the next piece. So you want to help people find their success, and
Yeah.
and it's waiting.
and what would you say to so if you're a corporate leader today, I mean, I'd like to frame it in two ways. For those of us who are just individuals and leading on with their lives, what are the things that we can do to think about super pollutants? What are the basic, simple things that we should be thinking about when we're just going about our daily lives? And at the same time, if I'm a corporate leader, what are the top three things that I should be thinking about?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I mean, all of us as citizens have a responsibility to our family first, but our community as well. And and when we think of what we owe our community, we should be thinking of climate and what we owe our family. I mean, your kids are going to grow up in a world that's going to be really tough if we don't make progress quickly. I mean, this is Jim Hanson's perspective with his grandchildren. I mean, he's like, I'm I'm getting at the toward the end of my career, he'll say, but I'm damn sure going to do everything I can to make sure the world is safe for my grandchildren for the future. So uh, there's, but we're not the ones who are ultimately the ones who are going to solve climate change, except through our political power. Yes, we should uh, consider getting an electric induction stove instead of a gas range. Yes, we should buy an electric vehicle if we can afford it. Yes, we should eat, lower on the food chain so that we're not cutting down more rainforest to grow for our beef you know so there are things we can do, but we have to aggregate our power into political power if you're going to really make change. And I grew up in the 60s. I was a student at Berkeley in 1968, 69. When we went on strike, we were fighting the then governor Ronald Reagan. We were trying to stop an illegal, immoral war, which we ultimately did stop. And so those of us in my generation, came of age feeling our political power. And we participated in the civil rights movement, we participated in the environmental movement, and we've made a lot of progress. Lately, it's again been challenged by the political divide. But I think we can overcome that as well. I mean, I've been reading about the how much wind power there is in Texas and North Dakota, and there are a lot of things, and you see what's happening with the current war and the oil supplies going through the Gulf of Hormuz, and you know, and Bill McKibben writes quite eloquently, and Paul Krugman both last few days saying, if you want energy security, you're much better with renewables, because there's nobody who's going to block the sun or the wind for geopolitical reasons. And so if you really, if you're a conservative Republican who's concerned about um, national security, as we all should be, this is a logical thing to think about. And I think in a peculiar way, the war might be educating people more about renewables. That if we had them, we wouldn't have gas prices going up and up and up right now. And so I think that can help overcome the politics that have been so divisive. Corporations, your second uh, part of your question. I mean, first of all, they should pay heed to the warning from Allianz. It's like the look at the cost of capital. What is the borrowing cost? What is the insurance cost? There's some big forces in capitalism to pay attention to. Supply chains or another. So that if you're getting your products sourced in part from distant places that could be interrupted by flood, fire, drought. Um, you got to pay attention. I mean, the world is going to be uh, deeply affected by climate change, even more tomorrow than today. And so you need to. You need to pay attention to climate to be successful in the natural gas world. And let's go back to the binding regulations in Europe, the European methane regulation. A coalition of investors representing $4.75 trillion in investment a few months ago wrote to the European Commission and said, we support your methane regulations as written and as scheduled. So don't delay and don't weaken. We consider well managed methane emissions to be a hallmark of a well managed company. And that's going to influence the price of capital. So your borrowing costs are going to go down if you're managing your climate emissions better. So there's a lot for the business world to pay attention to there. And then when they can lead, as Google is doing right at the moment on this new initiative, and the others, they should stand up and lead. This is if you have that ability, you want to take care of your shareholders and your customers and your employees, but if you can also lead, you know, stand up.
That's a great message, Durwood. I think you said it all, and I think that a lot was done in the past with thinking about investing in new technologies for example, reforestation, right?
Hmm.
New investments going into carbon dioxide removal, right? Now it really
Right?
seems
Right?
like the attention has come even to these big buyers, these big participants, sorry, investors, to really focus on super pollutants. And I do have high expectations and high hopes for this. And I think you're absolutely right. I think this is just the beginning. Maybe we're going to see finally some really big action on this front. And I think that it's kind of a ripple effect, right? If you have
Mhm.
you have the global methane pledge going on. You've got all these organizations
Right?
now digging into research.
Mhm.
You have this shift now. I remember one person saying, "Well, if global warming is 50%, sorry, if super pollutants are 50% of global warming, we can't be investing 0% of our efforts in tackling super pollutants." So I
Yeah.
think there is a shift going on.
Yeah.
So um, wonderful, Durwood. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot again every time I speak with you. I hope this message gets disseminated far, and people can learn about not only about our past, because I think everything that you mentioned, the Montreal Protocol was very difficult back then. The challenges we face today are also very difficult. So thank you. I really appreciate it.
My
Yeah,
pleasure. Good to see you, and I look forward to our continuing collaboration.
absolutely.